up here at the beginning was about the exam. Let me make sure I got the right thing pulled up. Yeah, there it is. So I know a couple of people have already started working on and turning in the exam, which is totally fine. If you haven't started working on it yet or you haven't turned it in yet, no worries. You still have plenty of time to work on it. Again, you have the rest of the night tonight and then also all day on Friday to work on the midterm and get it turned in. So from now until 11:59 p.m. on Friday is when you'll be able to keep working and finish the midterm. So make sure you start looking at it and get working on it today or tomorrow and get it turned in by tomorrow evening. As always, if you get a little bit stuck on it or you have any questions about stuff on it, feel free to send me an email, send me a text, let me know, and I'll do my best to kind of help you figure out what sort of problems that you might be having. And so midterm due Friday, make sure you get it turned in on Friday. And then normal school day on Monday. So for any classes that you have in the evening that meet on Monday, those are still meeting. And any daily assignments or stuff, like you'll have a daily assignment to do in this class on Monday as well. So just make sure you treat Monday like a normal day, even though if you have any daytime classes or if you know anybody in the day school, their schedule might look a little bit different on Monday. All right. So like I was saying earlier, today a little bit from the tiny microscopic level of, like, we were talking about the macromolecules with the proteins and the lipids and the carbohydrates and all that good stuff. And then on Tuesday, we talked a little bit about enzymes, a specific type of protein that do all sorts of different jobs for the cell. Today, we're going to talk about the cell itself. And we're going to start off by kind of looking at the basic differences between kind of the two major groups of cells that are out there. Oh, the other thing that I was going to mention is that the assignment for today, your Thursday assignment, your Thursday homework, goes really closely with these notes that we're about to go over. And so the different parts and the different blanks on the assignment that I posted go pretty much hand in hand with the different parts on the notes that we're about to take a look at. So if you want to have it open on another screen and kind of fill it out as we're going along, that's totally fine. Or if you go back to it after we finish up today, you should be able to go kind of slide by slide through these notes and fill in the correct information on that Google Doc. All right. So to kind of recap what we've talked about in biology so far, we started off looking at the really big level of the ecosystem and food webs and relationships between plants and animals and other animals. And we talked about how plants change over time. We went through succession and all that good stuff. So that's kind of way up at the high level of organization between plants and animals. Then we looked down at the super tiny level and we looked at the macromolecules, the lipids, the carbohydrates, the nucleic acids like DNA, proteins like enzymes, and talked about a little bit about what those were and how those worked. And so today we're going to move up a little bit to the cell level. So we're kind of above the molecules and biomolecules. Biomolecules is basically just another word for the macromolecules that we're talking about. And we're going to be focusing in on the cells, which themselves are the building blocks for things like the tissues and organs that make up the different parts of our bodies. So the first thing that I wanted to cover with you guys today is something that we're also going to be talking about a lot next week. And that is something called the cell theory, which is basically kind of a three-part description of the basics of cells, what cells are and what they do. So the first part of the cell theory is that all living things are composed of one or more cells. Whether you're a bacteria or a blade of grass or a human or an elephant or a redwood tree, if you're alive on planet Earth, then you are made out of cells. Every single living thing that scientists have discovered so far is made out of cells. So if you're alive, you have cells. Maybe it's just one cell, like if you're like a bacteria or an amoeba, or maybe it's billions of cells if you're a giant tree or an elephant. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function in organisms. They're the smallest piece of an organism that can live on its own, and cells are used to build everything else in the body of an organism. So everything in you, from your muscles, your bones, your stomach, your heart, your brain, your eyeballs, your fingers and toes, it is all built out of cells. There's all sorts of different kinds of cells, and we'll talk about those probably in a couple weeks. But they are sort of the starting point for all the other tissues in your body. Everybody on this call and in the world started life out as one single cell at some point. And then that cell grew and divided and grew and divided and grew and divided until eventually it turned into you. So the third part of the cell theory is that cells can only come from existing cells. New cells don't just pop out of nowhere. They don't just appear in your body one day. They have to come from existing cells. So anytime that you need to replace like blood cells or hair cells or skin cells in your body, every time that you have a little cut on your hand that heals up, those new cells, those new skin cells are built off of other cells. They only grow and divide off of other cells. So these three things are true for all cells and all organisms that science has discovered so far, especially here on Earth. Maybe there's other stuff out there in the universe that doesn't use cells, it uses something else. Who knows? But here on Earth, if you are alive, you're made out of cells, and those cells follow the cell theory. So everything's made out of cells. They're the basic unit that organisms are built off of, and they can only come from existing cells, cells that were there already. So there are a few more things that cells have in common. There are some things that you can find in every single cell of every plant, animal, bacteria, protist, fungi, whatever it is on Earth. So all cells have a cell membrane made out of lipids. So you may remember that lipids were one of our macromolecules, and we mentioned that one of their major functions is to help provide the membrane of a cells. And a cell membrane is nice because it's what protects the cell from an outside environment. It's like the barrier of the cell. It's like the walls of the house. It protects the inside stuff, and it stops the outside stuff from getting in. It also helps stop the inside stuff from getting out. So the cell membrane is our barrier. And every single cell on Earth has a cell membrane. All cells on Earth have DNA and RNA. So DNA in RNA were two types of nucleic acids, another one of the macromolecules we talked about last week. So every single organism on Earth is built with instructions based on DNA. And specifically, we use these instructions to build proteins. So proteins like enzymes, like muscle repair proteins that we talked about with the macromolecules, all proteins are built using the info in DNA. So again, no matter if you're a bacteria or a human or a live oak tree, your cells have DNA, which is used to make proteins. So because you have DNA, your cells have proteins in them. The DNA makes the proteins, which include things like enzymes. And proteins do all sorts of different jobs for the cells. Some proteins are enzymes. They help make those chemical reactions go faster. Other proteins help cells grow. They help make new cells. They help cells keep the internal and external balance correct. So proteins do all hundreds and hundreds of different jobs for the cells. So every single cell in the world has enzymes and proteins in it. All cells are also filled with cytoplasm. So cytoplasm is just sort of like the goo, the jelly that is on the inside of a cell. So a cell is not filled up with air. Instead, it's filled up with this liquid called cytoplasm. So all of the other parts of the cell, the DNA and the enzymes and the other proteins and the other stuff that we'll talk about later, like ribosomes and organelles, they're all floating around in the cytoplasm of the cell. So the cytoplasm is like the filler of the cell. And then finally, all cells have ribosomes, which are like our protein factories of the cell. So the DNA has the instructions, the ribosome is the factory, and then proteins and enzymes are the things that are built. So every single cell on Earth is made out of these parts. It's got a cell membrane going around the outside, protecting it. It has DNA on the inside with the genetic code. It has ribosomes that get information from the DNA. The ribosomes make the proteins and enzymes that the cell uses to function. And all of this stuff is floating around in the cytoplasm. So whether you are a bacterial cell, a mushroom cell, a grass cell, a dog cell, a human cell, a bird cell, a tree cell, a flower cell, an elephant cell, a humpback whale cell, no matter what type of cell that you are, these are the very basic things that every single cell on Earth has. So all of the billions and trillions of cells on Earth have a membrane, DNA, proteins, cytoplasm, and ribosomes. So that's what all cells share. They all have these things in them. However, that does not mean that all cells are created equal. So we can classify cells into two kind of major categories. We have prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now I know these are kind of big, weird, confusing looking words. Essentially, the prokaryotes are things like bacteria. So they're super tiny, simple, basic cells. So my job for you is when you see prokaryote, I want you to think small, simple, basic. That's what a prokaryote cell is. A eukaryote cell, makes up things like plants and animals and fungi. These are bigger, more complex, more complicated cells. So these are the big complex cells. So when you see eukaryote, I want you to think big cell, complex cell, a lot more parts in a eukaryote cell versus the simple, basic prokaryote cell. So, like I said, prokaryotes are super simple organisms like bacteria and some other single-celled organisms, whereas eukaryotes are things like the animals and plants that you're probably a little bit more familiar with. So if it's bigger than a single cell, it has to be a eukaryote. These names come from, I can't remember if it's like ancient Latin or ancient Greek, where pro means like before, and eu stands for like true. Carry is the kind of old ancient word for like a nut. And so scientists kind of use that to mean the nucleus of a cell, this big kind of central part that we'll talk about in a little bit. So if we put prokaryote and eukaryote together, that means prokaryote is like before there was a nucleus, and eukaryote means it has a true nucleus. So it does have a nucleus. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about what exactly is a nucleus in just a second here. But again, prokaryote, simple, basic bacteria. Eukaryote, more complex, more advanced type of cell. So one of the first major differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes is that all prokaryotes are what are known as unicellular organisms. So unicellular, uni is sort of like unicycle or like uno in Spanish. So that's like one single cell. So all prokaryotes are unicellular organisms. They're too small and simple to be part of something bigger, so they're all each one cell large. So bacteria all fit this category. All bacteria are single-celled organisms, so all bacteria are prokaryotes. Eukaryotes are the bigger, more complex cell. So there are some things that are single-cell eukaryotes, things like protists. So these are like little amoebas that live in the water. But for the most part, things like fungi and especially plants and animals are all multicellular eukaryotes. So they're all made out of more than one cell, and a lot of times more than one type of cell. So like in humans, we have bone cells and muscle cells and nerve cells and stomach cells and heart cells and skin cells. All these different types of cells, and we have billions and billions of them. So we are eukaryotes because we have lots and lots and lots of different cells. Yes, Nasima, question.
Yes, I want to ask you about the protist. Protist? What is that?
Protist is like a big single cell organism. You usually find them living in water. They kind of like swim around a little bit. They have sort of a blob shaped structure to them. And so I can actually look up pictures. There we go. So they're still single cell organisms. Here's a good picture. But they're bigger and more complex than bacteria. And so that makes them eukaryotes. So even though they're only one cell, there's still a lot more complexity in a protist cell than a bacteria cell.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Good question. So protists and amoebas and things like that are some of the few single-celled eukaryotes. Most eukaryotes are multicellular. So lots, hundreds or thousands or millions or billions of cells all making up one single organism, like a flower or a tiger or a bird or a tree. All those would be very, very much multicellular organisms. All right, so we got our simple, basic prokaryotes and our larger, more complex eukaryotes. Does anybody have any questions so far about these two different groups of cells? All right. So we've talked about kind of this first thing that makes these types of cells different. Prokaryotes are all single cell. Eukaryotes are mostly multi-cell. But what are some of the other major differences between these groups? How can you tell if you look at a cell if it's a prokaryote or a eukaryote? Well, like I said, prokaryotes are extremely simple, basic types of cells. So prokaryotes lack a nucleus, which is like a protective coating around the DNA, and other internal organelles. So we'll talk a whole lot more about organelles next week. Right now, it's essentially organelles are like small structures inside of a cell that help it function. So it's kind of like how humans have organs like a heart, lungs, stomach, stuff like that. Cells have organelles. So it basically means little itty bitty cell-sized organs. We'll talk about them a lot more next week, but prokaryotes don't have any organelles. They have those little ribosomes that are floating around in there, but that is it. And they don't even really count as organelles. So no nucleus and no organelles of any kind inside the prokaryotes. Those things are too advanced, too fancy for these simple little bacteria cells. So the DNA, because there's no nucleus, the DNA is just kind of floating around naked in the cytoplasm. There's no covering over it. There's nothing that is protecting it. It's just kind of floating in the middle of the cell. So prokaryotic cells don't have very much stuff in them. Eukaryotic cells have tons of stuff in them. So eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and other what are called membrane-bound organelles, which basically just means organelles that have a little membrane around them. So the nucleus, like I was saying, is this membrane that protects the DNA. So the nucleus kind of circles around the DNA and protects it. It's usually a really big organelle. You can see it pretty easily under like the microscope of a cell. So like if we go back for a second, these cells here, these would be a whole bunch of different prokaryotes, really small, simple cells. And this would be a eukaryote cell. So this guy right here would be the nucleus. So this is protecting all the DNA of the cell. And then all these other little structures in here would be the organelles. So the nucleus protects the DNA, and it's usually a really big component in sort of the central area of the cell. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, prokaryotes do not. Again, too big and complex and fancy for the prokaryotes. They can't handle the nucleus.
Is that black dot inside the DNA?
Yeah, kind of. It's, yeah, essentially, yeah, the kind of dark spot inside the nucleus represents like where the DNA is hanging out.
Okay, got it.
Good question. So we've got, so again, these guys both have a membrane that goes around them, and they both have cytoplasm that fills them up. They both have DNA, so prokaryotes and eukaryotes both have DNA, but in prokaryotes, the DNA is just kind of floating in the cytoplasm, whereas eukaryotes, it's protected. It's covered up by the nucleus. So the organelles in eukaryotic cells perform a whole bunch of different functions for the cell. Like we'll talk about on Tuesday and Thursday next week, there's an organelle that helps provide energy for the cell. There's an organelle that helps clean up the inside of a cell. There are organelles that help to package and ship around all those different proteins that are being made inside the cell, the proteins and the enzymes that are being made. There's organelles that help get them to exactly where they need to go in the cell. There's organelles that sort of act like the skeleton of a cell. They help provide extra support and extra structure inside of the cell. So there's lots of different types of organelles, but only eukaryotic cells have organelles. Nothing like that in prokaryotes. They're so small that everything can kind of just drift and go where it needs to go. Eukaryotes are big and complex, and they have all of these extra pieces like a nucleus and organelles inside of them. So again, prokaryotes, small, simple. Eukaryotes, big, complex, a lot of stuff going on inside of them. Have a nucleus, have organelles. So if you're able to like look down a microscope onto a cell and it's big enough to where you can see that it has a nucleus, you can immediately say, oh, this has to be a eukaryotic cell. No prokaryotes have a nucleus, only eukaryotes. So one of the other major differences is that prokaryotes are a lot smaller than eukaryotes. So here you can see our little prokaryotic bacterial cell here in yellow. And if you look really close, the little purple stuff kind of floating around on the inside, that's the DNA of this little bacterial prokaryotic cell. This is to scale with this obviously much more massive eukaryotic cell just behind it. So I didn't show the whole picture because it would take up more than the entire slide that we're looking at right now. So the eukaryotic cell is like huge compared to this little prokaryote right here. So one of the reasons why eukaryotic cells have all these organelles here on the inside. So here we have our nucleus of our cell. So that's one tip that it's the eukaryote. Here we have these organelles. That's the other tip that it's a eukaryote. So a prokaryote just has DNA and little ribosomes floating around the inside, and that's pretty much it. So because prokaryotes are so itty bitty small and tiny, they don't really need a whole lot of organization on the inside. Anything that their DNA produces, anything that the cell produces, it can pretty easily move throughout the inside of the cell. Eukaryotic cells obviously are way bigger than prokaryotes. So they need these organelles to help them move stuff around, to help get energy and get proteins and get carbohydrates where they need to go in the cell, because they can't just move from one end to the other on their own. They need these organelles to help them out. So the organelles help the eukaryotes be much more efficient and perform the different tasks inside of the cell much more easily than these tiny little simple prokaryotic cells. So again, they both have a membrane that covers the outside of the cell. They both have DNA. In prokaryotes, it's just kind of floating, and in eukaryotes, it's inside the nucleus here. They both have cytoplasm on the inside. So on the prokaryote, the DNA is kind of floating around in the cytoplasm. In the eukaryote, the nucleus and the organelles and all the other bits and pieces are also all floating around in the cytoplasm. So there are a lot of these kind of super basic things that they both have in common. Eukaryotes just have a lot more and a lot more complex things on the outside or on the inside. They're bigger, they have protected DNA, they have all these organelles to help them do all these tasks to keep themselves alive. Prokaryotes don't really have any of that. They've got this DNA and these little ribosomes, and that's pretty much it for the prokaryotes. All right. So if we did kind of a direct side-by-side comparison of prokaryotes and eukaryotes with their nucleus, prokaryotes, we'd say no nucleus in prokaryotes. The DNA is in the nucleoid region, which is a fancy way of saying it floats in the middle. Eukaryotes, though, definitely yes to the nucleus. They have that protection around their DNA. Organelles, not in the prokaryotes. They've got their little ribosomes that help make proteins, but that's pretty much it for their inside. Eukaryotes, lots of organelles. So all sorts of different things inside their cell to do all sorts of different jobs. Eukaryotes are much bigger than prokaryotes, so the biggest prokaryote is almost as big as the smallest eukaryote, and some eukaryotes can even be 10 to 50 times larger than an average prokaryote. We didn't really talk about that. We'll skip over that. So if we look at some of the basic structures, there is a little bit of overlap between our prokaryotes and eukaryotes. They both still have that cytoplasm, so they both have that kind of jelly filling on the inside where all the stuff floats around in. They both have a cell membrane, so they have that protective layer around the outside of the cell. We didn't really talk about the cell wall, but most prokaryotes have a cell wall. It's like a little extra layer of protection. Some eukaryotes have a cell wall, like plant cells especially. We'll talk about those a little bit more in detail next week. They have like an extra rigid cell wall that helps give them structure. Ribosomes, so that's one of the few things that prokaryotes do have on the inside of their cell. They still have DNA, and they need to turn the information in that DNA into proteins, and ribosomes are where that happens. So prokaryotes still use ribosomes to make proteins, just like eukaryotes use ribosomes to make proteins. They both still have DNA. In prokaryotes, their DNA is free floating. It's just kind of floating around the middle. And we didn't really talk about this. It's not super important, but prokaryotes tend to have circular DNA. So they have like one kind of circled piece of DNA. Whereas eukaryotes have a nucleus where the DNA is kept. And it's not just one big circle, it's a bunch of sections called chromosomes. We'll talk about that more towards the end of the semester when we start to get into DNA. And then finally, what types of organisms does each one fall into? Prokaryotes are made up of pretty much just bacteria, while the eukaryotes are almost all of the other living organisms on Earth. So things that we're really familiar with, like plants and animals and fungi and even protists, the kind of small amoeba protist-like single cell organisms that, even though they're small, they still are eukaryotes. They still have a nucleus and they still have a whole bunch of organelles on the inside of their cells. So some basic overlaps with the cytoplasm and the membrane and the DNA and the ribosomes. But major takeaway, eukaryotes are big, eukaryotes are complex. They have that nucleus to help protect their DNA. They have all those ribosomes to do all that different functions. Prokaryotes have none of that. They've got the DNA, they've got ribosomes, they've got little proteins floating around, and that's pretty much all. No nucleus, no organelles, very, very small, and pretty much, and all are single cell organisms. So prokaryotes are not advanced enough to come together and make organisms that are more than one cell large.
You said they're not?
They are not, no. They can only be one cell organisms. They can't get any more complex than that. All right. So hopefully that was a pretty thorough rundown of some of the differences between prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Does anybody have any questions, anything else about prokaryotes and eukaryotes that you're still a little bit confused about?
No, thank you.
All right.
So the eukaryotic cells, those are simple and basic, or no?
Eukaryotes are complex.
Okay, and then the prokaryotes are simple.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Exactly. So prokaryotes are bacteria, super tiny microscopic single cell organisms. Eukaryotes include things like you and me and your dog and cat and the grass and the plants that are outside of your house and apartment. So big, complex, multicellular organisms, those are eukaryotes. Only the tiny little simple bacteria are prokaryotes. All right, good questions. Let's see. So, like I said, the homework for today, the daily assignment, goes pretty closely with these notes from the parts of the cell theory to the different structures that all the cells share, to the different types of cells that we talked about, what different organisms fall under those cell types, and then finally, some of the major differences between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. So
the first question, can you please just go up? What do we need to do here?
So this is the cell theory, which was that initial kind of part that we talked about that describes all cells that scientists know about. So everything that is alive is made out. So there's three parts to the cell theory that I want you to write down here in 1, 2, and 3. All cells are all living things. Everything that is alive on Earth is made out of cells. Cells are sort of the most basic unit of structure and function. So they're the basic building block that all the other tissues and organisms on Earth are built out of. And cells can only come from existing cells. New cells aren't just randomly created. They don't just randomly appear. They have to be created from an already existing cell. So an old cell will grow and then divide and split off into new cells. And that's the way that we get new cells. They come from existing cells. So those are the 3 parts of the cell theory that I want you to fill in on kind of this first part up here.
Thank you, Mr. Michael.
No problem. All right. Great questions so far. Any other questions about the cell theory, the prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, or the cell type assignment for today? All right.
I'm good, Mr. Stanley. Thank you.
All right, no worries. So again, midterm is still up and going. So make sure if you haven't finished it yet, you have the rest of the night tonight and all day tomorrow to work on it and get it turned in. So please do so by the end of the week, by the end of tomorrow. And again, normal school day on Monday. So make sure that you're logging on to your Google Classrooms, going to any Monday classes that you have in the evening, and especially coming into your biology Google Classroom and doing your Monday daily assignment on, oh man, it's February already then, February 1st. So day school doesn't have any Monday classes. So if you have any day classes, don't have to worry about those, but still have a normal Monday schedule for night class.